Kevin received his PhD from the University of California in Irvine, and in his PhD he actually did some pioneering work in what people in sort of a very small clique of philosophers would now call formal social epistemology, really using mathematical tools, oftentimes from economics, but from all sorts of other disciplines, in order to study the way that information is shared and can be used by groups of people and how knowledge propagates through communities. Kevin's got a wide range of disciplinary or interdisciplinary interests that you can find out if you look at his website, Zollman.com. Is that it? Okay. So Kevin's done work in philosophy of biology, epistemology generally, and you can also see the breadth of his interest from his publication record. He's published in mainstream philosophical journals like the Journal of Philosophy and also journals like Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So there's a wide range of places. Kevin's, I guess, most recent thing that I guess I'll plug, in case it's not on the slide here, is he's written a book called The Game Theorist's Guide to Parenting. So if you want to see how to apply tools from game theory in order to manage children, I guess, check out Kevin's new book. So thanks so very much for being here, and I'll let Kevin take it away.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me and for putting together what is already looks like a great conference. And thank you all for coming. Just maybe so that we don't destroy the timing, let's try and do questions of clarification, quick little questions as I go along, so I don't want people to be confused and lost. But let's say the longer comments for the end where we can maybe have a more active discussion. I'm a little bit worried I have tried to put too much in already, so. So I'm going to be talking about something that I think is really complementary to what Carl and Jevin were talking about just a moment ago. Whereas they were talking about the question of what can we do to combat bullshit and fake news when we find it, I'm going to actually be asking a little bit more about the origins and sources of bullshit and fake news, in particular fake scientific news. And that's really what I'm going to focus on here. And I titled the talk with a deliberately kind of engaging title, Should Scientists Care About Truth? The answer, I assume you've said, yes, of course they should. And the real question that I'm going to be trying to ask about here is, should they care about other things too? And in particular, how do we feel about the fact that they might care about their own careers? And they might care about their own careers more than truth? And what should our reaction to that? I'm going to begin, though, by going back a few decades and talking about a very famous case of scientific fake news that occurred long before we had the term fake news. So some of you may already know the story of Hans and Fleischmann, but for those of you who don't, in early 1989, the University of Utah called a press conference so that these two scientists, electrochemists, could announce that they had discovered heat that appeared to not be the result of any known chemical reaction. This was almost immediately called cold fusion, and the promise was that this new method of generating heat would be able to not just advance our theoretical understanding of nuclear reactions, but could provide a clean, abundant, and very, very cheap source of free electricity. Excitement abounded. Everybody was very eager at the idea that we might be able to do this. That 1989 was the beginnings of a lot of the concern about climate change and the effects that electricity generation was having on the environment. And so people were very excited at the prospect that it might have been discovered. Hans and Fleischmann were famous electrochemists, and as a result, it made big news. Many of the journalists who were covering it were responsible journalists and didn't just listen to what Hans and Fleischmann had to say, but called other chemists and physicists to ask them about what they thought about the results as described by Hans and Fleischmann. And a lot of the other scientists at the time expressed substantial concern. They thought that what Hans and Fleischmann was describing was theoretically impossible. And so they said, I don't want to say that it's an important discovery until we've been able to look at it in more detail, until we've got more information, and until we've been able to replicate the study. And of course, because it was very exciting, almost certainly would lead to a Nobel Prize if true, as well as billions and billions of dollars, labs all over the world immediately began attempting to replicate Hans and Fleischmann's results. They took the descriptions provided in the press release, as well as pictures like this, and tried to figure out exactly how they'd done it, and tried to replicate the results. And although there were a few extremely rare cases of reports of successful replication, almost every lab that tried failed to reproduce their results. Not 2 months later, there was so much scientific controversy over Pons and Fleischmann that Time magazine felt comfortable running this cover, where they asked whether or not cold fusion might just be an illusion. Great headline writers should get a bonus for that. So the announcement came out in March of '89. This ran in May of '89. By the end of 1989, the general scientific consensus was Pons and Fleischmann were wrong. There was no such reaction. Pons and Fleischmann could not possibly have generated it, and that whatever was the reason, their reports had to be a mistake. So cold fusion was given up on largely by the scientific community for decades afterwards on the basis of the theoretical belief that it was absolutely impossible. The attention after 1989 into the 1990s turned to a very different question. Not was cold fusion possible or not, the scientific community had concluded definitively no, but rather, how did this happen? What went wrong? Why did two relatively prominent electrochemists come out and make an announcement that made headlines around the world, only to be disproven within months of their announcement of their findings? The most obvious and the first hammer out of the bag, so to speak, was they might have committed fraud. But most people thought that this was unlikely. It seemed an implausible fraud to commit. Pons and Fleischmann were already very famous. They had tenure and lots of funding. They had great reputations before they made this announcement. They had very little reason to want to commit fraud. What's more, if they were committing fraud, they had to know that they were going to get caught. An announcement of this magnitude was bound to be replicated, or attempted to be replicated all around the world, and to be verified, or not verified, by thousands of other scientists. And so the chance that they would get away with the fraud for very long was almost nil. So the community settled on the explanation that it's far more likely that Pons and Fleischmann made a mistake. A good faith mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. Maybe they had bad detectors, maybe they were detecting something in the lab, maybe something went wrong, but they just made a mistake. Then the question was, how could a mistake like this get out so quickly? Why didn't they check? Why didn't they double check? Why didn't they triple check? Why did they confer with other people? And as people began to dig into the history behind this, they found an interesting fact. University of Utah, where Fleischmann was, and Brigham Young University just down the road, where there was another investigator named Jones, were actually both doing research on the same phenomenon at the same time. Pons and Fleischmann became aware of Jones' research and were very, very concerned that Jones might get his publication out first, and that he would be credited with the discovery of cold fusion, and that he would get credited with the Nobel Prize and the millions and billions of dollars that might come from the discovery of cold fusion. They spoke with Jones. Yeah?
Did this also happen with Darwin and
Wallace. There's a different story with Darwin and Wallace, and let me put you off for a little bit, but I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah. And so they went down to BYU. They met with Jones, and they agreed that they were both going to submit their manuscripts to the scientific journal Nature on the same day. They would go to FedEx together to mail it together. Oh, the great days of 1980. But University of Utah and Pons and Fleischmann decided, although they were going to submit their manuscripts on the same day, that they would have a press conference a few days earlier. It's unclear the extent to which the University of Utah administration or Pons and Fleischmann were responsible for this, but the general consensus was that they had the interest in establishing themselves as the preeminent figures in this, and that the University of Utah had a financial interest in making sure that they got the intellectual property rights to what would have been $1 billion invention. This is a kind of case that makes people look at the way science works and worry. In science, it's a race. And in science, the second place finisher is merely the first loser. The person who gets all the credit, all the fame, all the glory from a scientific discovery is the person who got it first. And the person who gets there second, even if they worked independently, even if they worked just as hard or harder, rarely gets any. This is called the priority rule by the sociologist Merton, and has been the subject of a lot of investigation. And a lot of scientists and a lot of commentators on the Pons and Fleischmann debacle claim that that was really what was to blame. that Pons and Fleischmann were so worried about the Nobel Prize and the University of Utah was so worried about its intellectual property rights that they cast truth to the side and didn't pay much attention to the desire to avoid error in exchange for making sure that they were first, that they got priority. And this is not a one-off problem. This graph here represents the rate of retractions of scientific papers over time. The x-axis is time. They're not on the same scale. It's not as though more papers are being retracted than are being written. But the point is that the rate of increase is the concern. We're publishing more and more science, certainly. That's the black line. But we're also retracting at faster rates than we're increasing our publications. That's the blue and the red. Red is for fraud, and blue is for error. So the concern here is that while we're producing more science, we're also producing a lot more scientific bullshit. Yeah?
Quick point of clarification on
Yeah.
this slide. Is there a steep decrease just because the data comes
that was, so that this study was done in 2011, and so the reason you see this decline is because it takes a couple years for something to get retracted. So papers that are published in 2011, as of 2011, have not yet been retracted. I mean, I didn't do it, but I'm guessing that if we went back and did that study now, these points would be that's a very good point. Thank you for asking. Yeah, because later in the same paper, if you're interested, the site's here, later in that same paper, they look at how long it takes to retract papers, and it takes months and years in some cases. So a paper that's written in 1990 is going to be retracted by 2011, but one that's written in 2010, for instance, may not be retracted. Good. So this gives a lot of people concern. A lot of people are worried about the rate of scientific fake news that's being produced. And it's not just a matter of misleading science, but the worry is that it's misleading the public and giving the public a lot of reason to mistrust science as well. You know, you hear people, I hear my in-laws say all the time things like, oh, you know, I don't believe that whatever causes cancer because they're always saying something causes cancer and then they're always changing their minds, right? Butter was bad for you and now it's good, or eggs were bad for you and now they're good. And so whatever anybody says, scientists tell me to do for my health or my doctor tells me to do for my health, I don't believe them because things are good. And a lot of people put not just the problem of Pons and Fleischmann onto scientists' desire for credit and fame, but this onto scientists' desire for credit and fame as well. Right? The reason that they're committing fraud and publishing erroneous results is because they're driven to try and get famous, to try and publish, to try and get promoted, to try and get hired, and to try to get raises. And that when they get motivated by things outside of truth, that's what leads to problems. This isn't a new idea, though. This isn't something that just came about. In fact, it goes at least as far back as Adam Smith, who's a kind of odd figure to weigh in on these things. When Adam Smith wrote his other book, The Theory of Moral Science, he, as an aside, said this about science. Scientists, from their independency upon the public opinion, have little temptation to form themselves into factions and cabals, either for support of their own reputation or for the depression of that of their rivals. They're almost always men of the most amiable simplicity of manners, who live in good harmony with one another, and are friends to one another's reputations, enter into no intrigue in order to secure the public applause, but are pleased when their works are approved of without being either much vexed or very angry when they are neglected. Now, notice, the scientists are laughing at this one. It was no more true in Adam Smith's time than it is today. Isaac Newton was infamous for being incredibly vexed and angry when he was neglected. So I think we shouldn't read Adam Smith as making a claim about how scientists are or even were, but rather a claim about how he hoped they would be. 100 years later, the same opinion was expressed by the American philosopher and nascent social scientist W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that students must be careful to insist that science as such, be it physics, chemistry, psychology, or sociology, has but one simple name, the discovery of truth. Its results lie open to the use of all men, merchants, physicians, men of letters, and philanthropists, but the aim of science is simple truth. Du Bois was very concerned at the time that people would discredit sociology being done on African American communities, especially in the North, because they would think that scientists were motivated by political ends and not by truth. And he thought that it was very important that scientists only care about truth and care about nothing else in order for science to maintain a strong public reputation. It's a very interesting bit of philosophy of science. that never gets read because it's in this paper that's predominantly about something else, sociology of African American communities in Philadelphia. Now, so far, I've been pretty negative on the motivation of scientists towards things other than truth. But it turns out that there's another side to this story. In early navigation, especially in the early parts of the 18th century, one of the substantial things holding back global travel was the inability of ships on the ocean to calculate their longitude. It was very difficult for them to figure out where they were. Latitude was relatively easy, Longitude was very hard, because there were spins. That's what makes it hard. And so, in the early 18th century, the UK Parliament passed a law offering an enormous, at that time, financial reward for anybody who could make substantial advances that would help ships to compute what longitude they were at, from any method whatsoever. They didn't care how, they just wanted it done. Into this fray entered, not a scientist, but a watchmaker, John Harrison. John Harrison was already famous for making very, very good watches. And he thought that the best way to be able to compute longitude would be to be able to keep accurate time, so you could figure out what time it was you were looking at the sun or the stars. The problem was the most accurate clocks at the time used pendulum in order to keep the time, and it turns out putting a pendulum on a boat that's rocking back and forth is not exactly the way to keep time. They had pocket watches that didn't use pendulum, but they were notoriously unreliable. They would be ruined by noon, much less days and days and days. So he set about to invent a better pocket watch. He invented 4 different prototypes, each that used different mechanics that were used for hundreds of years after in the invention of in the use of watches, and then finally settled on this, which is now called H4, his 4th watch, which was used for hundreds of years for navigation after that. Not only did he advance watches, which is a pretty cool thing just to begin with, but the ability to keep more accurate and regularized time was critical not just to international commerce, but critical to lots of other scientific endeavors as well. Lots of scientific experiments required the measurement of time. If you want to measure the rate of falling of a body, if you want to measure how long a chemical reaction takes, you need to be able to record accurate time. And so the advances in clocks was not just about advancing British colonial interests, but was also about making scientific advances. Now John Harrison, the baseball player, John Harrison had no interest in science. Josh has no interest in science either, but he got into this because of the money, because of the prize offered by the British Parliament. So here's a case where we have real news, not fake news, real news, motivated by not the desire for truth, but rather the desire for fame and fortune. In fact, he got into an argument with Parliament because he didn't want to let anyone know how he had made his great clock, because he wanted to be able to sell it. And Parliament told him he couldn't get the prize unless he told other people how he did it. He did tell him and got the prize. And again, John Harrison is not a one-off story. Right? Science is advancing, and we have pretty clear evidence that it is. So this is a graph of the number of human-infecting viruses that we know about over time. Here's a graph of the number of planets that we've discovered outside of our solar system. Here's a graph of the number of sequenced DNA base pairs over time. And all of these are just in the 20th century. If we were to start thinking back in the 19th and 18th century, science is progressing at a remarkable pace.
Kevin, why are any of these advances?
Why are they these advances? Well, there's a short and a long answer to that question. The short answer is these are things that we regard as probably true and things we like to know. And so we regard them as advances. Not just in the mere facts, like there is a planet, blah, blah, blah. But the other thing this graph encodes here, for instance, is the methods that we're using to detect them. So not only are we learning that there are more planets, it's a little hard to actually see on this graph, because I made it so small, but the methods that we use to detect them are themselves advancing as well. So that's a good question. There's a longer, more philosophically complex question of what does it mean for science to advance? I'm putting you off for that one. Okay. That'll be beers tonight. Okay. And then I'll put you off over beers. Sorry, did I say that out loud? Okay, so I've left you with a bit of a struggle. Right? We've got 2 stories. Hans and Fleischmann, bad. John Harrison, good. Some evidence that There's a lot of Hans and Fleischmann's out in the world, and some evidence that there's probably also a lot of John Harrison's out in the world. And how do we resolve this? How do we decide whether it's good or bad for scientists to care about credit and to care about what they're doing? Well, there are lots of ways of answering this question. The way that I prefer, and the way that some of my colleagues prefer, is to build models. Not with Legos, unfortunately. I would really prefer that, but with mathematics. So what we do is we create simulated or artificial scientists, and we put them into the petri dishes of our analysis to find out what they would do under various circumstances. And we ask, do scientists who care about their career produce more and better science than scientists who don't? Yes or no? Now, of course, we can't answer that question in full generality because science is socially so very complex. We can't answer it in all different ways, but what we can do is we can ask it in very particular circumstances. We can say, here's a particular thing that scientists need to do. Are they made better on that particular thing, yes or no, by engaging in scientific advances? I'm not going to give you any math, so don't run away, at least not yet. But I'm going to give you the big highlights of the answers that we've found so far. And at the bottom of the screen, unfortunately it's a little low, but at the bottom of the screen will be citations if you want to see the details. There are details on this. If you don't see a citation or you want to ask more questions, feel free to ask me. But this is also an ongoing and interesting field. So there are lots of questions that you're going to have that I'm not going to know the answer to and that nobody knows the answer to, in part because this is a new and thriving question. But the first thing that I think is really important, and this is something which is a long ago realized fact in philosophy, but it's always worth repeating whenever we talk about science, is science isn't perfect and we don't want it. So this is a complete, there's no real number here, I'm just trying to illustrate a fact, so don't take this to be anything really super. But the idea here is that we don't want to either be completely tolerant of mistakes or be completely intolerant of mistakes either. So this graph, so to speak, is representing scientific progress on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is how tolerant we are for error. If we start out and say no error will be tolerated, we can make no mistakes in science. Science must be perfect. Nothing gets published until we're sure it's right. We want there to be 0 retractions ever. We're never going to make any progress. Science is imperfect, and it has to be, because we don't know what the future is going to be like. We can't predict the future perfectly, and if we demand absolute certainty, we'll never publish anything. And science will make no progress. So if we go around saying a single retraction is a mistake, and any retraction indicates that we have a problem, we're going to end up sacrificing at the altar of perfection any possibility of making scientific advances. But on the other hand, it's equally a mistake to go in the other direction. Say, publish whatever you like, who cares how much we retract, we'll just sort it out in the end, is not going to be very good either, because one of the things that science does, and that it's very important that it does, is it builds on one another. I don't have to know everything there is to know about mathematics and biology and physics and chemistry. If I want to make scientific advances, I can rely on the work of others. But if we're completely tolerant to error, I don't know. I'm in the situation of the US on Facebook. I don't know what things I can trust. And so I don't know what things I can build on and make further use of. Yeah?
Is humility the right word to use? We need more humility, maybe? I mean, to also admit that we're wrong or announce that we don't know when we say something, but we're just...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
Absolutely. Humility is definitely something we want, but we want a little bit more than that, too. So scientists, it's important that they be willing to admit when they make mistakes. This is critical for the scientific practice. But we also want them to be careful enough that they're not just making tons of mistakes. I have ideas. I've had ideas that I'm like, this is great, I should write it up into a journal article, and then I sit down and work on it a little bit more, and I go, no, sorry, that was trash, right? And because I have a little tiny bit of pride, they didn't make it into the journals, whereas if I had just been like, who cares, I'll just get it out there, everyone else will sort it out, people might have built on it, not discovered my error, and then been committed to errors themselves. So that's why we want to make sure that we can't just be completely tolerant and humble, although I understand we do need to be humble. You're absolutely right. What we want to do is find the balance. Now, of course, where's the balance? It's in the middle somewhere. That's the helpful answer you're getting from me today. But this is something we always want to keep in mind when we look at empirical studies of science. We don't want to say because there are retractions, something is wrong, although we may be concerned that the rate of retractions is increasing. So that's something. So what you'd love to hear from me, and the big question here, is whether it's good that scientists seek to claim. Does that make science better or worse? If we could get into the heads of each and every scientist and flip a switch to make them care about truth and only truth, should we do it? Would that make science better? Would we want there to be fewer Pons and Fleischmans at the cost of also having fewer John Harrisons? And the answer you're going to get from me, I'm afraid, is it depends. Like a good philosopher, I'm going to refuse to answer your question. The reason it depends is because it turns out that in different aspects of science, the desire for a claim is good in some cases and bad in others. And it's not just that I'm going to say it depends, but I can actually tell you on what things it depends, and on what particular aspects of the scientific program are benefited and what aspects are harmed. Now, the broad question, on balance, is it better or worse? That's one that we don't really quite have a sense of how to answer, but we can at least say some more concrete things about what things it helps and what things it hurts. So first, let's look at what's it good for? What does the desire for claim do? Here's a short list of the various things it might do. In particular, and this is best illustrated by the case of John Harrison, it increases the total effort produced in science. How does it do that? Well, it brings people in, like John Harrison, who wouldn't have even been a scientist, but for the desire for money and claim. It also speeds up their work. It encourages them to not dilly-dally or waste time on things that don't matter or are unimportant. And it also encourages them to do more work than they might ordinarily otherwise, to ignore leisure time activities, their family, and social obligations in order to do better science. And maybe that's good for science. It might not be good for the individuals, but it's at least good for science. So the first thing is that having fame as a motivation to scientists is good because it increases the amount of science that gets done. And that's obviously good. The second one, which is a little bit more, or maybe I should say a little bit less obvious, but still not that hard to understand, is that the quest for fame actually encourages scientists to share their results with one another. This is where the example of Darwin, I think, is really illustrative. So Darwin, some of you have heard this story, Darwin worked on his theory of evolution by natural selection for well over 18 years without telling almost anyone about it. Not published, didn't write a book or a pamphlet or anything. And it was only when Wallace sent him a letter saying, hey, I developed this new theory, what do you think about it? And Darwin saw a lot of his ideas already in there, that Darwin panicked and decided he had to get his ideas. If it hadn't been for Wallace, Darwin might have worked for another 18 years without telling anybody, or maybe he would have never told anybody. But the fact that Darwin was concerned that somebody else would get credit for Darwin's ideas made him decide that he wanted to share his results early. And so in fact, it turns out that encouraging scientists to care about credit in a lot of situations encourages them to share more. And in fact, credit is exactly what differentiates science, which is genuinely open, although not perfectly so, from technological research, which is genuinely done behind closed doors with an enormous amount of secrecy. Another important thing is that if people care about credit, that gives us as society a lever that we can use to help direct scientific effort. If all scientists care about is truth, they can decide what truth is important to them. And there's nothing we can do to encourage them to work on things that are of eminent social importance. On the other hand, if we can do things like create Nobel Prizes or longitudinal prizes or X Prizes or other things like that, we as a society can help direct scientific effort towards issues of substantial social importance. And so by having scientists motivated by something that we as a society can control over them, it allows us to, sometimes good and sometimes bad, direct their effort in ways that would be socially productive. The last way that it can be productive, and this one is perhaps the one that's most difficult to explain quickly, is that it actually encourages science to engage in a certain amount of productive risk-taking. In science, there are a whole litany of theories that for a long time people thought were certainly false, that ended up being true. And the problem is, in science, no theory is completely ruled out, almost ever. It's always possible that something will come about to bring it back. Most scientists who would only care about truth would say, look, looks like the theory is true, I'm not going to work on it at all. But a scientist who's interested in making that big splash and doing that thing that nobody else can do can say, I'm going to pick up one of those discarded theories. Yeah, it's probably wrong, I'm probably wasting my time, but think about what my career would be like if it was right. I could win a Nobel Prize. And there are lots of cases in the history of science of people who did that for that reason and ended up moving science ahead. And so there's certain types of risk-taking that truth-motivated scientists alone wouldn't engage in, but scientists motivated by credit and acclaim would, that can help make science more productive. Now, of course, I told you already, and you already know, credit doesn't always lead to good things. There are also costs from seeking fame. Yeah? Yeah, absolutely. So my favorite example, because I think it's really plain and easy to explain, is research into the history of peptic ulcer disease. So peptic ulcer disease is caused by a bacterium. That was a going hypothesis for a long time. In 1954, I want to say, I might have the exact year wrong, please. Definitive experiment proved that bacteria couldn't survive in the human stomach. And so the theory was thrown away for decades. And then two Australian researchers who most people thought were crackpots, and might well have been crackpots actually, went about successfully proving that it was caused by a bacteria. And there are millions of people now who have been cured of their peptic ulcers because of it. They won Nobel Prizes. But, you know, I mean, it's hard to figure out why they did what they did. Even their autobiographies are inconsistent. So it's hard to know whether it's the credit motivation exactly or not, but one suspects. So the first is the one that is probably what happened with Tom's inflection. Seeking fame encourages scientists to cut corners, to fudge their data, to rush without doing the proper checks, to not make sure that they've dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's. And in fact, one can show that even on that graph where I said, there's an optimal risk tolerance for risk in terms of what we want from science. You can show, my former student Brent Coheson was able to prove in one of these mathematical models that the quest for credit will always lead to being a little off the best. You'll always be doing, each individual scientist will be taking a few more risks with error than we would like for them from a social perspective. An interesting avenue of research that's being conducted right now by researchers Justin Bruner and Taylor Connor at Australian National University, University of California, Irvine, respectively, and then a student of mine, Liam Kofi-Bright, is about the ways in which the quest for fame and the desire for credit compound social injustices in science. So where dominant majority groups can take advantage of their dominant position in order to extract more credit than they deserve from collaborators or students who are from non-majority groups. So this is another cost. It's not a cost in terms of necessarily scientific progress, but it's nonetheless a social cost that's important. So I've given you the benefits, I've given you some of the costs. There are also two things that the care for credit alters in weird ways. It both increases and decreases in different places. The first way is the choice of problems and diversification amongst different approaches to the same scientific problems. So this is one that there's been a lot of research with, including Carl Bergstrom has worked on this problem as well. The question of how is it that scientists might optimally choose which problems to work on. It turns out that when scientists care only about truth, they sometimes misallocate themselves amongst projects. But when they care about credit, they also misallocate themselves, but in completely different ways. So it can sort of make some problems better and make some problems worse. And so this is one of those cases where there really is nothing universal to say. It just leads to differences. Sometimes they choose better, sometimes they choose worse. Most paradoxically, sometimes fraud can actually be hampered by the desire for credit, which that seems really paradoxical. But this is work done by my current student, Liam Kofi-Bright, where he points out the scientists who care about truth have an incentive for fraud as well. If I think the data that I generated is misleading, is likely to convince you incorrectly of the false conclusion, I have an incentive to falsify or to hide or to misrepresent my data so that it doesn't mislead you in a way that I think it might. And so that's a type of fraud that a truth-motivated scientist would engage in. Of course, credit-motivated scientists have all sorts of reasons to engage in fraud too. If they think they can get away with it, they can get famous on the back of it. So fraud is one of these weird cases where the truth motivation encourages one type of fraud and the credit motivation encourages a different type of fraud. And so it's hard to say whether it's better than this. So overall, what do we have to say about this? The desire for credit, the desire for fame, the desire for acclaim in science has both good and bad aspects to it. At the same time, the desire for fame is going to produce embarrassments to science like Hans and Fleischmann and cold fusion, but it's also going to produce important discoveries and advances in science like John Harrison and his clock, his advances that come along. And so we can't say that we shouldn't want to go through and flip that switch on all the scientists and make them care only about truth, or make them care only about credit, or make them care exclusively about scientific progress. Instead, we find ourselves in a difficult position of saying, well, we don't really know how much benefit comes about from it. But what we can do, and what we do want to try and do, is now investigate the details of how that works. If scientists are going to care about credit, we want to make sure that the way we give them credit is a way that does the best with that desire that we can. And this is, in a lot of respects, the same debate that goes on in economics. You know, do we wish that everyone didn't care about money? Well, it's not clear that we would want to do that even if we could. But what we can do is make sure that we don't create financial incentives for people to do immoral things, or at least we minimize those. And I think that there's an analogous discussion that should take place when we start thinking about science as well. We couldn't probably stop scientists from caring about credit, and it's not clear that we should do that if we could. But what we can do is we can make sure that to try and sand off the rough edges as much as possible, to create the circumstances where scientists who pursue credit aren't put in a position where they have to do things that are counterproductive to truth. And we do that by investigating the various ways that the credit motive can help and the credit motive can hurt scientists, in the hopes of getting a complete picture so that we can think about how we might reform science in subtle ways in order to try and make it so that scientists' incentives for credit line up with our social goals for scientific progress. Thanks.
Okay, so we have a lot of time for questions, so I'll bring around